Hi, everyone. I'll be relatively quick. So, Marc Etienne, nice to see all of you here today. Maybe a few words on procedurally how the task force is moving forward, just to inform kind of your own understanding of what our work is. There were roughly 20 of us who were named on the task force. We have a 30-day period to both consult with people informally and to ultimately draft our recommendations for the minister by November 1st, which is a Saturday. So I'm hoping that actually gives me up to the Monday morning to get it done. We were all given kind of specific areas of responsibility. That doesn't mean that we can't make recommendations more broadly on other aspects of a national AI strategy. But mine were specifically on sovereign AI infrastructure. And so I've been spending much of my time talking with people who have a point of view in this space and trying to inform as much as possible my memo, not only from my own perspective on these questions, but by kind of those of other Canadians who care on these files. Obviously, it's a complex thing to get through a lot of the hype and get through a lot of fuzzy terminology and get through a lot of marketing to also understand kind of what we are trying to solve for in the first place and what types of capabilities we have and what types of alternatives and what kind of strategies we want to deploy. The minister was quite clear in asking us to have big, bold ideas. It's part of why they went for a 30-day delivery timeline. Essentially, they didn't want us to all meet and kind of wash down our points of view to get one big consensus position. They expect the 20 members to have often conflicting positions go up, but they want those ideas to be as kind of crisp as they can be. A portion of the work is also, and this is just my own take on this, but figuring out the tactical steps to be able to execute against some of those higher level objectives. Is one thing to have, you know, a strong objective for something as diffuse as sovereignty in the AI space. It's another to kind of properly define what you're trying to achieve and then the steps that you can take to try to get to that endpoint. All this within 30 days, so also a realistic take as to what we can accomplish. The work's not done on November 1st. We're meant to continue to engage with the minister on an ongoing basis with essentially conversations as requested by him or his staff. And then the minister has put in a self-imposed timeline of roughly 30 days after that to digest the different perspectives, also from those of people who've just submitted them through the open portal, as well as those of the task force. So procedurally, that's what's going on. Any questions on the procedural steps? No problem if not. Yep, nice to see you.
Sorry, question, you said a self-imposed deadline.
Yeah.
I just wanted to understand the tail end of your sentence. You said the minister had a self-imposed deadline of 30 days after receiving the input.
Yeah.
To what?
To produce the actual national AI strategy.
Seriously, to
Yes.
have it done. Oh, impressive.
Yeah. If I were to bet, there is a G7 ministerial on December 8th in Montreal on industry and tech. That would be a nice landing spot to make an announcement for an actual strategy. That's not to say that every program is tied up, that every sub-deliverable is, but I think it's circling a plane until you get to the landing strip, and successfully getting to lower and lower levels or closer to precision. I think that one will likely be much lower than in altitude than whatever is part of a budget announcement in a few weeks. I can talk about what I'm specifically doing on the sovereignty and AI infrastructure question. This is a work in progress, so by all means ask me questions if you, or challenge me if you disagree with parts of this. But you have to understand in the first place what the actual demand for compute is and which components of that demand can be met by sovereign infrastructure, in quotation marks. I put the quotation marks because you also then have to define what you consider to be sovereign infrastructure. And that necessitates a pretty deep understanding of the AI stack from top to bottom and what your alternatives may be to the types of dependencies that you're trying to hedge against. So on the first part, on what the actual demand is, understanding the difference at the very basic level between training infrastructure and inference infrastructure. Those are, I don't know kind of what the varying levels are of understanding of the AI infrastructure space are in the room, but training, if you're trying to build a net new model, if you're trying to fine tune a model, has a compute infrastructure that is different than the type of compute infrastructure that you will use for inference. Inference is when a model is in production. Say you're watching Netflix and it gives you a recommendation for the next movie, that model's in production. You're not trying to build a new model, you're working with an existing model. What the actual Canadian demand is on both sides of that compute is not a clear thing. So while we know that we want to have a greater degree of control over the stack, understanding the amount of compute that you actually need to meet that demand is one point. And the second layer is the degree to which it splits between training and inference, and a third, the degree to which that needs to be sovereign compute or not, depending on what you're trying to achieve. There's also a difference in the training space between folks who access training capacity at different layers of the AI stack. So if you actually get raw compute capacity, so GPUs, and you have a building, and you have networking capability between your GPUs, and you have megawatt supply into that building, the bare metal compute capability can allow you to train a model, but the number of organizations and the number of people in Canada who know what to do with bare metal compute are relatively low. And so matching what your domestic supply is, if you are looking to have a degree of domestic supply, to the type of people who can handle what you are offering them is another question. Most organizations access compute, whether on the inference side, or not so much on the inference side, but I'll stick to the training question, through intermediary layers of compute orchestration, of DevOps, so to support the development process of applications and so on. Without those intermediary layers, it's very difficult for most organizations to actually know what to do with that compute. And so that's another question of the sovereignty stack. It's one thing to be able to own a degree of GPU capacity, but are you building an Olympic stadium that no one uses? Or are you building something that's actually useful for people? And to what degree do you have the ability to offer those services or to layer the software stack on top of that, or the operationalization stack that allows people to then make use of that compute infrastructure? So that's yet another layer of complexity on top of that. So these are the types of questions I am struggling with and wrestling with, and then trying to find out not only what Canadian supply can be to match that demand, but also alternative models that provide a degree of hedge against risk of coercion, which is at the core of why there's been these sovereignty questions in the first place. So that doesn't necessarily have to be Canadian ownership. It can be, for instance, reliance on open source software as another form of hedge against dependency and lock-in. So went kind of deep there, guys, for a minute, but hoping it gives a little bit of color, the types of questions we have to ask ourselves, and also just how complex it is. I've gotten many people who've told me we need to spend at least $20 billion on new compute infrastructure. Well, $20 billion of public money is a very real ask when they can't fix, my kid's primary school. So let's try to make sure we're trying to match something that actually is both required, is useful, and meets the actual demand that we think that we have. Any questions, comments, concerns? Yep, at the back.
Yeah, I've been reading recently, so there were concerns about the fact that some people calling what's happening in AI a bubble. I also heard concerns about the fact that NVIDIA has deals where they're stimulating the demand for their own products in a way that's somewhat circular. I don't pretend to understand any of that, but I've just heard concerns being raised. So when you're trying to forecast demand, is it based on the current trajectory of the market, or is there, how reasonable do you think these concerns are? And when we're trying to forecast demand, are we based on the current trajectory of the market, or is there kind of of a zone that is based on also what might happen in regards to these concerns?
Yeah, a few questions in there. Am I worried about a bubble? Yes. I think it's a very realistic assessment of where we may be heading. But to be clear, kind of similar to the dot-com bubble. Dot-com bubble didn't mean the internet was useless and was never going to work out. There's a question between kind of how over-leveraged some components of the financing may be versus like the ultimate utility of AI. I have zero doubts about the ultimate utility of AI. I do have doubts about the financing infrastructure for components of AI, and frankly, mostly for training infrastructure questions. And part of that is built off of frontier questions. So if you're trying to play in the frontier model development game, you are playing at an exponentially different level of compute need than if you are playing at a level where you're trying to have enough domestic supply to train smaller models for specific applications, say in the mining sector, or if you are trying to just ensure that you have sufficient inference, which is a different type of computing infrastructure, as I was mentioning before. I think the bubble space is mostly in the training space, training compute space, and frankly mostly associated with frontier training. And just for an idea of scale, if you were trying to train a GPT-6 model level size right now, so something like in the trillion parameter model size, you would build compute infrastructure similar to what the Stargate compute infrastructure that OpenAI is building in Texas looks like. That is a roughly $500 billion project if it gets built to the degree that is they're aiming to build. With something 1/20th of that size, every company in Canada, every organization in Canada, not for profit, every government department, and throw in all of those equivalents from Australia as well, could train a 90 billion parameter model. Huge difference. So if you're not playing in the frontier game, then the questions are radically different as to what the objective is that you're trying to achieve and the amount of compute that you need. So you're pointing to a lot of important considerations. What I'd push back on is also just kind of unpacking what it is that you are trying to achieve. And so if you're not playing in the frontier game, which, spoiler alert, I don't think we should, specifically in providing compute infrastructure for frontier training, then the questions become very different. The other question that's an ancillary one to that is, how do you build, and that's the most complex one I would say, the project financing component of any infrastructure build out to take advantage to a certain degree of the amount of demand and of capital currently available in this space to create public advantage, essentially, versus missing the boat on that. And I will end with this, Frank. Like, here's a couple quick examples. The UK signed a deal a couple weeks ago. It was in the UK last week with the US, the kind of US-UK tech deal. Part of that, there was a Stargate, a mini Stargate cluster for OpenAI in the UK. It's a UK developer that is building out the compute infrastructure, so there's a degree of domestic value because N-Scale gets to build that out and gets compute investment, gets an anchor customer essentially for a data center build out. So that's not a bad thing, but that's essentially the end of the kind of public value component of that build out. OpenAI is building infrastructure for its own purposes, for its own model development needs, leveraging frankly limited megawatt availability in the UK. In parallel to that, there's a similar Stargate deal in Norway where the financing is brokered by Aker, which is like essentially a macro holding in Norway, similar to Brookfield, say in Canada, but where about 30% of the compute cluster's capacity is reserved for public use. So you could see that there's different financing models depending on how you structure the deal, where you still play with OpenAI because of the demand that they're bringing in as a kind of an anchor tenant, if you will. But depending on how you structure the deal, you can actually get a greater degree of public benefit. And so that's like the secret sauce that I think every country is trying to figure out. And it's a complex one, and because of the bubble component, potentially a short window to get that right too.
Yeah, I was just gonna, maybe I missed that question because I had to step out, but you mentioned that the government doesn't want to put $20 billion in, and I get that. Is there somebody on the task force that's looking how we get private investment and how we do tax reform in Canada? Because that's what it's going to take to get that private investment. Because I don't know why the government would put anything in, frankly. They should be, if this is a viable business, which it is, why would the government be putting any money into it?
To be clear, the government's going to do what the government does. I'm on the task force. I make my own recommendations. They will then make their own decisions. I am not a member of the government. I don't think that they should put $20 billion on something that is, purely publicly financed in the current context. I think there's better outcomes than that. As to if people are looking at private investments, I think they are. The sovereignty layer of the consideration is where you get a bit of a wrinkle on that. Depending on your interpretation of sovereignty, if you go straight to the baseline Westphalian state, then you're going to say, well, the physical infrastructure is in my country, ergo, ultimately, I control it in one way or another. Or you go several layers above that. Well, is that infrastructure actually U.S. owned or owned by another entity? In which case, what is the degree of control that I actually have on it? And alternatives in a worst case scenario, which is kind of the additional layer that we're being asked. If it's just about unleashing private sector investment, then all you would do is copyright reform. Because frankly, copyright liability is is the greatest hindrance to CSB investments in training compute infrastructure. When they build it out and they look at different jurisdictions, Japan has a very clear Texan data mining exemption. Japan got it, don't quote me on this number, but I think it's $80 or $90 billion of private sector investment in training compute infrastructure. But that's because it's a place where people feel it's safe to train a model. If you train a model in Canada, it tends to be seen as the most potentially legally risky jurisdiction in which to train a model with regards to copyright liability. And so why would you build infrastructure if then everybody says, if I train my model there, I'm exposing myself to billions and billions and billions of dollars of potential fines? That's a basic question of how this market is functioning. It depends what you're trying to achieve. So that's part of my recommendations is be crystal clear on what you are trying to achieve, be as precise as you can, and people in government are trying to do this work as well, as to what the different categories of the stack are and places in that stack where you can play or build a credible alternative, and then have a difference between what you do today and then what you do in 3 years and 5 years and 7 years and what your plan is over that duration. I think that's an important component as well. All of this rests on essentially scaling laws. Scaling laws are the idea that the more data that you put into, the more compute that you have, the more the models are going to perform. It makes sense for the NRC to stimulate research in this space that looks at alternative architectures where they don't rely on scaling laws for performance. And then you've just, in a second, democratized who can play in this game, because right now it's really a two-horse game if you're thinking about the frontier game. So again, lots of different questions are kind of understood under the umbrella of sovereignty, AI infrastructure, and trying to unpack those in under a month, and have about 8 days left to draft those recommendations.
Do you have time for
Two more questions, sure.
Just a quick question about power. The megawatts required. Is this private infrastructure investment, or are you leveraging the public utility network? What's the model there?
In Canada, currently there's the example we're giving is TBD, right? I don't know what the ultimate model the government will pick for a potential kind of build out. The way that cloud service providers work depends on the jurisdiction. So in a place like Alberta, they'll allow you to actually do your own private energy build outs, and you can be behind the fence, as they call it, to power your data center. So for instance, AWS in the US, bought or ensure the continued survival of a nuclear power plant and built the data centers right on that nuclear power plant. In a place like Quebec, because of the nature of the Hydro-Quebec monopoly, you have to purchase your hydroelectricity directly from the provider, like any other industrial player would. And then it's a question of kind of megawatt allocations based on industrial preferences of that jurisdiction, plus the ability to pay. In pretty much every jurisdiction on Earth, because of the amount of demand for AI compute infrastructure, any megawatt availability is claimed. It's just about who gets preferential access to that megawatt availability. It's also why you tie a lot of energy development to AI infrastructure plays going forward.
Last question. Perfect. So I've got the last question, the pressure. It's not a procedural question, but a back to basics question.
Yeah.
The panel before you talked about maybe we don't actually have common understanding of basic concepts like access and privacy and AI sovereignty. So do you share the same, and Elna's pointed it out, I was wondering if you have the same thought, and is that something that the task force is actually, going back to this fundamental basic question, and what is the government's perspective on AI sovereignty?
So again, I am not the government, so I can't speak to the government's point of view. I can't even speak to the task force point of view because we were all asked to have our individual thoughts, and they specifically didn't want us to collaborate. So I can give you my thoughts on that. So I just want to be clear so that people don't interpret that my point of view is the government's point of view. I hope it will in 30 days, but no guarantees on that front. So it's true that, as I was laying out before, sovereignty means radically different things to many different people, and depending on who you're talking to, it's leveraged for marketing purposes by many different organizations, and that's not exclusive to Canada either. I think we need to boil down what the actual objective is of what we're trying to achieve when we talk about sovereignty, and I think it's actually like a series of objectives, what the trade-offs are in trying to achieve that objective, and then what the different tactics are to try to get to ultimately what you're trying to achieve. Now, this all sounds like saying a lot of words that don't mean anything, but practically speaking, if you were trying to say tomorrow morning, we don't want to work with cloud service providers, we're going to build that entire stack domestically, the R&D spend of AWS is greater than the entire private sector spend on R&D in Canada. That's not a moonshot. That's like 1,000 moonshots. Okay, but if you look, like I said, at like raw compute capacity, like bare metal, that's actually, there's not much of a moat there. There's companies like Hypertech that have deals with NVIDIA, can do straight build-outs, can frankly get preferential megawatt access over most cloud service providers. You can provide that. So if you're worried about training compute capabilities to support Mila and Vector and those types of organizations, maybe a couple of big banks, that's not that hard to solve for. If you're worried about broad dependencies of people like, I'm inventing this is not a real use case, but say Canadian Tire or Tim Hortons, they use like Canadian staples, and their ability to access AI capabilities, they are not accessing that through bare metal compute. They're accessing that through those intermediaries. So in their context, what does sovereignty mean? And what's the actual risk that you are perceiving in the first place? Is it, some people have pointed to the Cloud Act. I think the Cloud Act is a red herring. I don't think it's an actual real problem, or a more of a different problem than it is for any other Canadian supplier. Are you worried about kill switches or kind of political coercion based off of your dependencies on US-based infrastructure and how that could be leveraged against you in a trade negotiation? That's a different set of considerations. It's not a Cloud Act-based one. So you also have to be real as to what it is you are kind of pivoting against. And then to add yet another layer of complexity, this is often really kind of an industrial policy play in different language. It's about like, well, if we're going to spend $100 either of public money or of private sector but Canadian money on AI infrastructure costs, how many of those dollars are staying within Canada? Different question. Is that a sovereignty question in the sense of control, or is that a sovereignty question in the sense of creating wealth, improving, or is it improving domestic productivity through access to latest and greatest tools? It depends how you define it, and they're each real important questions. I think that's it for me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.